This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern, and today's interview is being recorded in front of a live audience here at the 2016 Limmud Conference in Birmingham, UK. My guest today is a world-renowned Middle East historian at Ben Gurion University of the Negev and Georgetown University in the United States. He's perhaps most well known for his seminal book, The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem, which was instrumental in revolutionizing the historiography of Israel's War of Independence. But he's also the co-author of a forthcoming book examining the history of the Turkish-Armenian relations in the 19th and 20th century, which is what we're going to talk about today. Professor Benny Morris, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you for having me.
So how does an expert of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the War of Independence, someone who's written numerous books about the Israeli-Palestinian issue, come to explore Turkish-Armenian relations?
Because I've written numerous books on the Zionist-Arab conflict, I've become tired of that subject and I looked for a new subject.
And what was it about the Turkish-Armenian that attracted you and not the history of medieval Japan?
Well, it's nearby and I sort of know the Middle East, and it's a subject of controversy. There are arguments among historians about what actually happened and what time period we should look at. And so it attracted me intellectually.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what is really the new approach to the issue?
A piece of research, and eventually the book will come out, I hope in a year's time, by myself and a fellow Middle East scholar called Dror Ze'evi. And we looked at Turkish relations with their Christian minorities between 1876 and 1924. And we came to the conclusion that the problem wasn't restricted to Turks and Armenians, but to Turks and all their Christian communities, Armenians, Greeks, and Assyrians. There were actually more Greeks than Armenians in the empire at the time. And over a 30-year period between 1894 and 1924, the successive Turkish governments, Ottoman, Young Turks, and then Ataturk, essentially got rid of their Christian communities. We're talking about 4 or 5 million people, killing many of them, Armenians, Greeks, and Assyrians, and expelling the rest. Mm-hmm. And so Turkey today has no Christians, essentially.
So the Armenian Genocide that happened over the First World War is just one episode in a much longer...
It's a centerpiece in that destruction of the Christian communities, but it began 20 years before and ended 10 years later.
Mm-hmm. Was it as violent before, 20 years before the genocide? What was really the modalities of that expulsion?
Well, it varied, but under Abdul Hamid II, from 1894 to 96, there were a succession of massacres, mainly of Armenians, in which 100 to 300,000 Armenians were murdered during those 2-3 years. And then what happened in World War I, 1915-16, was a second stage in the destruction of the Armenians, in which somewhere between 600,000 and 1 million were murdered and the rest expelled. And there was a third stage in which most of the Greeks were expelled or murdered. At least 300,000 were murdered, and about 500,000 Assyrians along the way, between 1918 and 1924. So, and the rest of the Armenians, there are Armenians who remained alive or had returned to Turkey at the end of the war or just after the war. They too were murdered or expelled during 1918, 1924 under Ataturk.
Why do you think these episodes of murder and expulsion get less press than the Armenian genocide itself?
I'm not sure. Look,
you're not sure?
It was more dramatic, and it occurred in a short time period. And World War I is a dramatic period which interests lots of people around the world. And it was concentrated, that is, the expulsions and the murder in 1915-16 were concentrated and well covered with political intent by the Western allies, by the Allied powers, in order to blacken the image of the Turks. So it had worldwide publicity. So there are a number of reasons, as I say, but the subsequent murder of the remaining Armenians after 1918 and of the Greeks in very large numbers and Assyrians probably got much less press, but was quite bloody or equally bloody.
Mm-hmm. What were really the intentions of the Turks in implementing?
Well, it depends which Turks you're talking about, but the governments, all three of them, Abdul Hamid, the Sultan, and the Young Turks who succeeded him, and Ataturk, who founded the Turkish Republic, essentially wanted a Turkey without Christians. And this was driven by religious fervor. The killers themselves were Muslims, and they wanted to get rid of their neighbors, or if they were soldiers, to get rid of the Christians. There was a fear of Christian ascendancy, or at least a rising of Christian power, economic power, intellectual power. So this caused jealousy among the masses and a desire by the state and by neighbors to acquire Christian property and Christian women. About 100,000 Christian women were simply stolen or abducted into and converted into Muslim households and children.
Was the Christian community of Palestine affected in any way by these policies? Because it was ruled by the Turks at the time. No. Is there a reason?
Well, there were very few Christians in Palestine, and they didn't belong to these three categories. They weren't Armenians. I mean, there were maybe a few hundred Armenians, early on in Palestine, but there weren't any Armenians, Greeks, and Assyrians. The Christian community in Palestine was Arab, and the Turks didn't wage a genocide against Arabs.
It was more an ethnic thing than a religious one.
No, it was religious. I think it was driven mainly by religious impulse, but they also began to see certainly the Armenians as an ethnic and eventually national challenge as well to the Turkish dominance. There were nationalist movements among the Armenians, 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s, which in some way threatened Turkey or Turkey itself with perhaps dismemberment. And as World War I occurred, they were seen as a treacherous fifth column, the Armenians. The Greeks less so, and the Assyrians not at all, but the Assyrians are the litmus test. The Assyrians had constituted no threat to the Turks nationally, and nonetheless they murdered them in large numbers. Hundreds of thousands were murdered. So it was, as I say, a religious impulse, but it was with a level above it of a nationalist intent as well, and fear. And there was very real fear among the Turks of the Armenian evolution into a full nationalist movement and separatism.
Were they really on the way to become a national force to be reckoned with?
Yes and no. It's difficult to assess. They weren't a serious national force and did not disrupt the Ottoman Empire or the Turkish state at any point in time. But there was suspicion, and some of it was well grounded, that some Armenians had assisted the Russian army during the clashes in the Caucasus in the initial phases of World War I.
You mentioned your co-author, Dvořile Evi, who's an Ottomanist.
Right.
And I would like to ask you perhaps a methodological question, whether your previous scholarship on the Zionist-Palestinian conflict informed your new project in any way.
I don't know. Reviewers will maybe comment on it. I don't know.
No, it wasn't.
It doesn't have any real connection.
It doesn't
to,
okay.
Except, if you like, the idea of Islam in conflict with the West and Christianity in some way. That also informs the Zionist-Arab conflict to some degree.
Well, people, maybe reviewers, will be drawn to draw parallels between the Nakba and the Armenian Genocide.
No,
there's
no parallel. No,
No?
there is no parallel. No, the Nakba was a disaster, as the word means, for the Palestinians, but it did not involve genocide. It was a war between two national groups, and eventually drawing in Arab countries. But it was a struggle between national groups over a piece of territory, albeit with some religious elements, but there was no destruction of Palestinians. There was a war. Many Palestinians fled. A few were killed. There were small massacres. If you talk about 800 or 900 people, as compared with the Armenian Genocide or the genocide of Greeks, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of thousands, over 1 million, somewhere between 1 million and 2 million Christians were murdered by Turks. Nothing remotely comparable occurred in Palestine.
Mm-hmm. No, but I'm trying to think not so much in historical terms, but perhaps in more theoretical terms. The way you actually study the two phenomena. You said there are really no parallels.
No, I don't think so.
Okay. All right. I'm going to open to the floor for questions. Has anyone got a question? Yes, please.
I was wondering whether your research sheds light on the way genocides work in general, sort of the mechanisms in which governments enlist public or popular support for genocide, for people, murdering their neighbors, and what kind of relevance that has maybe today as we think of this.
Well, there are certainly major parallels between the Holocaust, the murder by the Nazis and their helpers in Europe in the 1940s, and the killing of Christians, or the massacre of Christians in the Ottoman Empire. But there are also major differences. The state in both cases coveted and wanted to put their hands on wealth of the minorities they were busy killing. There were deportations eastward or southward in the case of or southeastward in the case of the Ottomans, which paralleled in some way deportations of Jews eastward, as well accompanied as well by deceit. That is, both governments used deceit to persuade the people to go willingly rather than to struggle by telling them they're going to new resettlement rather than to death camps. But the process in that sense was very similar. It was dissimilar in the sense that a large number of Turks, civilians, soldiers, policemen, but also just civilians and tribesmen, Kurdish and others, carried out the massacres both in 1894, 96, 1915, 1916, and after 1918. Whereas in the German case and their helpers, it wasn't neighbors killing neighbors, it was the German state and its apparatus, soldiers, SS, police, and Eastern European auxiliaries doing the murders. It wasn't just neighbors. You do have occasional neighbors, like in Jedwabne in Poland, neighbors killing neighbors, but that wasn't the norm. The norm was the state doing it, and very few people actually took part. Very few people among the Germans took part in the killings. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, but no more. In Turkey, we're talking about a population killing its neighboring population.
I want to ask you about getting access to the resources. I mean, the Turkish
sources.
To sources. The Turkish attitude towards the Armenian genocide is very well known. I'm assuming that there's a similar attitude towards the previous chapters. Was it really difficult to accumulate any of that historical information about what happened before the genocide?
The archives are in Britain, and the National Archive in Britain, the National Archive in America, the archives of the various missionary societies in America. They all had groups. That is, the British and the American and the French had consuls around Turkey, around Asia Minor, in various places in the empire. In addition, the missionaries, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of missionaries over these 30 years serving in Turkey in various places, and they actually saw what was happening and reported freely backwards. Where you have a problem is in the Turkish archives. And there were also, of course, German consuls and German and Scandinavian missionaries spread around during this period in the empire. So they saw what was happening and wrote back what was happening, and these records are well preserved. Where you have a problem is in the Turkish archives, which presumably have had or have somewhere lots of information about these successive massacres and the decisions taken along the route by the officials, by the government in Constantinople and then in Ankara. But those archives have been thoroughly purged. So a lot of Ottoman and then Turkish material is either doesn't exist or is hidden away in some safe. But you can find supplementary and complementary material in Ottoman archives, and this was done by Drawers Evi, who's an Ottomanist and knows Old Turkish, New Turkish, etc.
Mm-hmm. Okay, any more questions? Yes, please.
What's your view on the politics of the recognition of the Armenian genocide or the non-recognition of it around the world, including in Israel, and also of the place of the Armenian genocide relative to the Holocaust in genocide remembrance in international culture today?
Well, those are big questions, and I've never dealt with them. I deal with what happened. It's a different field. There are people who write about that, about how states have come to grips or haven't come to grips with what happened and what the Turks did and so on. Personally, I'm critical of the Israeli government for not officially recognizing, and the American government for not officially recognizing what happened, which was a genocide. But as I say, it wasn't restricted to Armenians. They also were busy killing hundreds of thousands of Greeks and Assyrians during this 30-year genocide, as I call it, and probably the book will be called The 30-Year Genocide.
All right, Professor Benny Morris, a world-renowned Middle East historian, and the author of a forthcoming book about Turkish-Armenian relations in the 19th and 20th centuries. Thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
And also big thanks to Tammy Goldenberg, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick. Our co-host Daria Shandlin will be back with us shortly, but in the meantime, don't forget to visit our new website, telavivreview.org, like us on Facebook, and follow me on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.